everyone, and welcome to today's session of the lecture series. My name is Katharina, my pronouns are she, her, and I am your host for today. We are streaming live from our Düsseldorf studio in Germany. And for those who don't know, the lecture series is an educational streaming series focusing on a game development topic each time. And each session consists of a presentation and a Q&A that follows. So if you have any questions related to the topic that we are presenting, drop them in the chat and we are trying to answer them afterwards. Today we are focusing on procedural generation, and I have Alexander Müller with me, who is senior game designer in Düsseldorf and who will give you a very interesting insight into how game worlds can be generated procedurally. And if you want to know more about the lecture series in general, you can have a look at our website. The link will come into the chat any second. And with that, Alex, I hand over to you.
Nice. Hello. My name is Alex. I'm, as mentioned, senior game designer here at Ubisoft Düsseldorf, and mostly, working in R&D, as you would say. So research and development with a couple of prototypes. What I would like to do today is to talk about procedural world generation. That's my expertise here. So let's start with the summary. So first, we start with an introduction, talking about myself and also what procedural generation actually is. Then we will dive into how to create the whole world with procedural generation. Then we will talk about the unique way of thinking while you're using the ProcGen. And of course, in the last part, we will talk about the future. So how will procedural generation be used in the future, or how it might be possibly used? And as an epilogue, I will just post a couple of links to more information, mostly GDC talks on YouTube and so on. The whole presentation will take roughly 40 up to 45 minutes, but it might be faster or slow, but let's see. So more on myself. As mentioned, my name is Alexander Müller, senior game designer at Ubisoft Düsseldorf, and I started with an apprenticeship as an assistant in network technology, and then kind of switched to gaming or game development. I never worked in network technology again, so I'm kind of a queer in that space and didn't study anything. I worked 7 years on the Anno series, going from 1404 to 2070, a couple of add-ons and Anno Online. I also worked for 4 years on the Settlers Online as lead game designer. And for 6 years now, I'm working in R&D as a technical designer. That's it for myself. So procedural generation, what is it actually? So procedural generation, or ProcGen for short, is a collection of tools, systems, or a framework or methods to create content for games automatically. And this is based on a predefined set of rules. We will talk about this in more detail later. So, procedural generation in games. So procedural generation is nothing new. It has been used for decades already. And here you have a couple of examples. We have, in 1984, there was a game released. It's called Elite. And it had 256 star systems, all procedurally generated with a randomizer, so each planet was unique. And they used a seed for that. So 256 variations. So they made star systems out of it. And 20 years later, well, not really, 30 years later, they released a sequel. And it's called Elite Dangerous. And this game contains the whole Milky Way galaxy. So millions of star systems. And yeah, that's the size comparisons in the last 30 years at least. So, but there is also other stuff that can utilize procedural generation. So for example, we have a couple of tools we are using here. One of those is Adobe Substance Designer, and you have the possibility using nodes to generate textures there procedurally. Another one is Side Effects Houdini. You can basically generate everything there, from objects to textures to terrain and everything that you need for your world. And of course, you can also generate landscapes procedurally. Here is an example from Unreal 5. They have an internal procedural system. It's rather simple, but it does do the job perfectly fine. So what I would like to do today is not talk about tools or textures or models, but about procedural world generation, which means game worlds where parts or everything is generated procedurally, starting from distribution of vegetation, of wildlife, NPCs, or maybe even quests. And I would like to focus on flora, so vegetation in this case. We will touch a little bit on fauna, but it's a little bit too much to dive into every single point. So let's move on to how do we actually generate a whole world. In the beginning, you start with the terrain. So here is an example from Far Cry 5. And your terrain is basically your landscape or your surface of the world you are creating. You have mostly mountains over there, you have valleys, you have your hills, and the whole topography is defined here. So there are different types of terrain, and each type is well picked based on the requirements of your game. So we have, for example, a simple plain, which is just, as mentioned, a plain with textures put on it. And it's the fastest and most easiest approach to generate terrain, but it doesn't provide you any bigger benefits. You could also make a mesh out of it. So it's a volumetric system where you're basically not using a plane, but creating a whole object out of the terrain. And this allows you a little bit more of, I would say, impact or authoring. You can modify the terrain and adjust the environment that way. Or you go full simulation and use voxels. Voxels are basically three-dimensional volumetric pixels, as you would describe. And each voxel has or can have physical parameters. So you can say water is flowing, for example, or sand is washed away by water. And this allows for systemic gameplay. So as we mentioned, that you can basically pour water on sand and then it will wash away the whole sand. It's very costly because you basically have to calculate each single voxel in that case. And it depends on the resolution. For example, if you use Minecraft, they have 1 meter per voxel. So each block is 1 voxel. But if you go higher, like let's say 10 centimeters per voxel, it explodes. So I would not recommend using that unless you really need it. So now we have terrain, right? Let's start with the distribution of ecosystem. First, we need to segment our world. So we have our world and we divide it into ecological regions. And each region will receive a name and a couple of information related to that. So here we picked our world and divided it into 5 biomes, and each of those in a specific area. So once we did that, we can establish those locations, and you can use different methods. One method is, for example, how Unreal uses it. They use volumes. So they put a volume inside a level or on the terrain, and this volume defines the biome that has to be distributed. But you can also do a couple of other things with that. You can, for example, pick or put a lighting preset on that and kind of define the atmosphere of that biome on top of that. Or you can distribute specific scripts or whatever related to that biome. Or you use a mask. This is an approach I prefer personally, because it also allows an artist to come in and just paint the mask per hand and then define basically where exactly the artist want a biome to be. So, but there is also a different method, a slightly more complex method. So in this case, we would like to calculate the biome distribution. And to do that, we need to pick a classification method. There are a couple of new known ones representing the real world. So the first one is from Robert Whittaker, and it's the most famous one, where you get the basic biomes like the jungle and the temperate region. But my favorite is actually the Leslie Holdridge life zones. It was created by Leslie Holdridge in 1947, and it's actually a three-dimensional pyramid where you take precipitation, temperature, but also evaporation into account. And it's pretty granular, so you have a lot of biomes and ecosystems there. So once we pick a classification, we have to define the climate to distribute the biomes. So this, for example, is a painted temperature map. We took Europe as an example and just expanded it a little bit and went a little bit crazy for this. You can paint it, as I mentioned, that's not a big issue, but you can also use directly the terrain to calculate the climate itself. So for example, terrain elevation can be used to calculate temperature. With increasing height, the temperature will drop. Or you use a slope, for example, for calculation of water flow. That is how you would get a humidity map, for example. You would calculate precipitation that is raining down, and then using the terrain flow, you would calculate where the water is gathering, for example. You can also find lakes that way. So it's really powerful. So now we have our classification, right? We pick as an example here the Holdridge life zones. We simplify it. So instead of a three-dimensional pyramid, we make it two-dimensional. One axis is temperature, the other is humidity, and we distribute the ecosystems there. And now we take two masks, one for temperature, the other for humidity, and run the whole distribution through that, and you get your biomes correctly distributed on your map using those two parameters. It's pretty simple. It's also pretty fast. It took me like a couple of minutes to do this example. So it's very effective. Okay, now to the material distribution. So we defined our biomes, we have a terrain. Now it's time to put a little bit of materials on that terrain. And this here is an example where we also utilize terrain data specifically to distribute materials. This example is relying on curvature. Curvature is basically the bending of the terrain. And there are two versions. The first one is convex, which is outwards bending like a hill. And the second one is concave, which is inwards bending like a cave. And this is how you could also memorize those two. If there is a cave in that name, it's going inwards like a cave. So here in that example, we have the grass material, which is also responsible to distribute the grass meshes, is put on the hills, so on the convex side, while the sand itself is using the concave, so it's kind of in the valleys and in those areas. So you saw the biome segmentation. So we have segmented our world into different biomes, and each biome comes with its own asset list. So trees, objects, game objects, structures, whatever you want, specifically related to that one biome. So you have a forest with your pine trees, oak trees, conifers, leaf trees, or you have your desert with your cacti and maybe olive trees, not oil. Yeah. So once you do that, you pick your, there is an arrow. Okay, let's just show it completely. Okay. There we go. So when you have your objects, those objects come with distribution parameters. In this example, really simple. It's a distance between the objects themselves. So if there are two of those placed, that's the general distance between those. Probability is the probability of that object to be placed on a point, and the scale of the object. You can use a couple of other parameters like maximum slope. So trees are not placed on really steep areas like cliffs or mountains. And using that data, you generate a distribution point cloud. So you define points which are then occupied by the object itself. And this is a really simple approach, but you can really go crazy. You can use random, but procedural doesn't mean it is actually random. In fact, it is not. So we had our temperature mask, which define the biome distribution. So we grab that temperature mask again, and then we modify it, in this example, with an attraction curve. So let's take conifer trees, for example, a pine tree. It prefers colder regions like boreal or temperate, and it never appears in the jungle. So you could create an attraction curve that is pushing the colder temperatures up on the probability scale, which means that preferably that specific tree will be placed more likely in colder areas than warmer areas. So that way you modify your temperature with your curve and you get your probability mask, and you use that one to calculate the distribution points. And as you can see, the previous mask was filled with points, and this new one is only pushing points out which are specifically in the colder areas, so in the northern part of the region. And then you continue with your object placement. On top of that, you can also reduce the random factor further. So what we use in procedural gen is so-called a seed, which is basically a number or a constellation of any type of letters or whatever. And each letter is basically responsible for the calculation during while the algorithm is calculating. So each value is resulting in basically the exact same outcome. So if you change the seed, it will be generated procedurally. You will get a different outcome, but as long as you do not change the seed and you regenerate, this outcome will be always the same. And unless you change the seed again, then you get a new outcome. This is, for example, used in many games where you generate a map for your PlayStation. There is most likely a seed somewhere that you can copy and give your friend. And then when they use the seed, they get the exact same map as you did. So they can play it or compare it and so on. And we call it determinism. So the outcome is basically of the algorithm or of the calculation is predefined using that seed. So we ensure that the tree, if it's placed, it's always been placed in that position. It's also important for multiplayer games because, well, you can't make one person not having a tree and another having one. That's unfair. So, so much to the generation of a game world on a simple method. It's really more complex, but we can dive into that a little bit later. So the unique way of thinking that is required for ProcGen is very interesting aspect of it. And this is something I learned while working on procedural tech. So ProcGen in general requires logical thinking and a more rational approach. So you do not go mostly with the visual aspect. So, oh, it's looking good. Yeah, that's the final result. That's what you want in the end. But you are trying to create rule sets. So out of anything, you can go out into the world, into a forest, and then ask yourself, well, why is a certain plant in that specific area? So, for example, there are plants growing right next to water, and you have to ask yourself, why is it happening? So if that plant is preferring high humidity, then that is something that can be put into a rule. Or you can define, for example, where should I place gravel? So small pebbles as a material on the ground. Well, gravel is mostly a result from flowing water. So picking the water flow of the terrain is a nice data to distribute materials. So you get your cavity like concave with the flow, and you most likely get the proper area for the gravel material. Or also the interconnection between stuff. So for example, what impact does a specific structure like a tower or a house have on vegetation? So for example, houses should suppress vegetation or trees. So you have to keep an eye on that. And the premise here is that every condition can be made into a set of rules. So anything that you see in the world is most likely based on some kind of rules, and you can extrapolate those rules out of the real world or out of concept art or gameplay requirements, depending on your game. So I would like to show you an example, but before I do that, I will just introduce the technology we are using to generate that example. So what we are using is PS, that is short for Procedural Environment Systems. And it's a set of procedural world generation tools. It's built into Snowdrop as a module. So when you are developing a game, you can activate it or deactivate it, depending on your needs. It was partially funded by the state of North Rhine-Westphalia here in Germany. That's why we can actually show stuff from it. And it's an image-based generation, which means we are using masks mostly. And this allows us to run the whole generation on the graphics processor, on the GPU, because GPUs are basically built to throw pixels and to calculate pixels. So using images is the fastest way when you're using GPUs. So, and here is the example. It's a little bit crazy. We tried to structure it a little bit better and use coloring and so on. But it showcases everything you need to know. So it's a node graph. We are using the node graph system in Snowdrop. And it's a logical hierarchy, as you would say, for processes. You have, in the beginning, you have the data. So everything that is related to the information you need for distribution, like the height map. You also have the seed over here, and you have the asset library over here with all the parameters and distribution attraction. Then you take that data and calculate your biomes, distribute those, and move on to the structures. So this is the first step of the hierarchy. Structures are man-built things, so not natural things like trees, but houses, walls, and so on. And since they should impact vegetation, they have to be calculated before vegetation. So we can extract their position, calculate the area around them, and then exclude trees. So trees are not clipping into the house and so on. You also have a couple of terrain data down here, mostly, I think in this case it's moisture and fertility also on. Fertility is then refined further on. Using that data with your biomes and your temperature and fertility and so on, you can define where materials should be. So you can use the steepness to define like cliffs areas, or you can use flat areas to define like biomass for earth, for example, where vegetation should grow. And using that data, you can, oh yeah, there are a couple of masks over there. I think in this case it's fertility and a couple of other refines. I think we are also using in this example only three material, rock, earth, and gravel, I think. And that is already leading to good examples. So in the next, you refine your data. So you now know where your materials are. You can use them to refine the fertility. So for example, when you distribute sand doesn't hold much water normally. So you can use it as a modifier, as an additional modifier, and lower the fertility in those areas. So nothing appears on beaches or in the deserts and so on, or less vegetation. And then comes the big part, where you distribute the vegetation. In this example, we used 4 biomes. And, well, it's 2 biomes with 2 ecosystems each, forest and meadows version. And we have a really lush boreal one, and the other one is rather dry, kind of a stone desert type of location. Well, once you distribute the vegetation, you can put the right materials into the positions you defined there. So materials what? A little bit of VFX, maybe a weather mask. This is basically also an image that can be used to support shaders. So for example, if you have a lake and you're close to it, then you can use a shader to make the sand wet, basically in the vicinity of the water. And we use weather masks for that. And in the end, you place everything. So you calculate, and in the end, the algorithm is basically putting the trees there, materials there, and the terrain, everything else. So as you can see, that's an example of a whole hierarchy. You start with the bigger things, and then you go smaller and smaller until everything is distributed. But it's also only the, as you say, the surface of the whole logic, because this one is not a node but a whole compound, and the compound is a container of a new which can contain a new graph or further nodes. So let's take a look at this specific compound. It's the distribution compound for vegetation. As you can see, it has a couple of inputs, mostly data like moisture, bedrock, so where is the rock, so we can make trees avoid that, and so on. And those inputs are then used in the whole graph to distribute the vegetation. And here you have a sub-hierarchy where you go with trees. So we distribute trees, and then we use information from their position to impact the distribution of bushes. And then we again reevaluate, go back, take all that information again, and then distribute the clutter. Yeah, it's rather complex. And by the way, each of those examples here is also not a node, but a compound. So it's kind of inception-wise, we can go deeper and deeper until we reach the endpoint. It's rather complex, and yes, it does contain math. So I'm sorry if you if you have problems with that. That might not be the right thing for you. It's not much, but you have to, at least as I mentioned, to think logically and to have a rather rational approach to that one. Okay, so much for an example. It can go more complex, of course. So we might have a second part here, talking about ProcGen in details. But let's now talk about the future of ProcGen. So the idea here is to, as I mentioned, everything can be put into rules, and everything can be created or generated using procedural tools. And I think that this will be true for the future in general. So our game worlds now are getting bigger and more complex. So we are now approaching, realms of simulations in that case. So the size, the complexity of the world requires that granularity of data or simulations need. That's why future games will basically simulate everything. So going from the whole climate with the soils. So what sort of type of soils do you have? Do you have rock? Do you have sand? And then we simulate that behavior. So for example, using voxels in that matter to simulate real sand behavior. And then what happens when water is poured on that, and can it keep it, and so on. And that data can be used then to place a tree. So when you pour water on sand, maybe it will change, and then a little bit later a tree will grow out of it. So I would like to show you an example of how such a game world might look like. So again, the process is the same. You start with the terrain. But in this case, as I mentioned, everything is simulated. So we can take data or information from real life examples about the soil types, for example. We used Scandinavia for one prototype, I think. It led to pretty impressive results where you could define what type of soil is placed where using the data existing already there. But also the whole climate. So we will simulate the whole climate from precipitation, clouds kind of being caught by mountains, rain down, and then use the water flow to calculate where water is gathering, and then establish the amount of ground humidity, as I would say, the amount of water in the ground, which then can be used to distribute vegetation, for example. So you could define, okay, if humidity is high, then it's most likely to be a rainforest and less likely to be a desert. So in the next step, you would distribute your flora, and this would happen species-wise. So you can pick a species of vegetation, like we used previously a pine tree or ferns, and then define attractions for them. So for example, the preferable temperature, how much water does it need? what soil type does it grow on, and so on, and simulate basically, or use that data to let that species pick their location or their position themselves. So pine trees will most likely be in colder regions, like boreal ones, and palm trees will be in tropical regions. Then you continue with fauna, so with wildlife, and you gather or you grab all the data before that, even the data from the flora, because you can use it as additional distribution parameter for wildlife. For example, berry bushes as a feeding source. So you can define, okay, how does the wildlife behave? Where does it reproduce? Where does it eat? Where does it sleep? And based on, for example, time of the day, you can spawn those entities dependent on that in those areas. So for example, if it's night and you have like cat-like creatures who are hunting during the night, then you can put them active. So when the player is running around at night, you will encounter more cats, basically. And the next one is structures. So everything that is built by man, so like whole settlements, buildings, whatever you would like. And this should also be this will be simulated later on. We already have a couple of algorithms that can build you a whole settlement with roads, because there is a certain structure how settlements are built in real life. There's most likely a center building. At the center of the settlement, it's a church or a town hall and so on. And then roads are going outwards from there, using the terrain and so on. So we can calculate that completely and place the whole settlement. Moving on to the actual game itself. So everything gameplay related, all quests, all objects, all NPCs will also be placed procedurally. And using simulation here will allow us to make it whole dynamic. So when the player reaches an area and he has certain conditions on him, then we could use that data to block an NPC from spawning, for example. So if you solved a quest somewhere else and then you arrive in a new city, and then we can change the outcome of that. And of course the player itself. So the player will get a lot of tools in those games. He will most likely be able to make a lot of changes to terrain, cut down vegetation, and all of that, each action will have an effect on the world. So each action done by the player will impact the world and change it. So I am pretty sure that the future world we are building will be more systemic. So everything will be interconnected, and you can learn the systems of the world and basically use them to your advantage. And most likely everything will be simulated, but we will see. So I think to simulate everything, that's a lot of calculations and a lot of complexity. So there is a lot of hardware required to do that, and it's currently difficult on a normal machine. That's why we here at Ubisoft, specifically in Stockholm, are developing a technology to push those calculations into the cloud. So they are not done on the machine of the player, but are calculated in the cloud. And I think that's a video here about Ubisoft Scalar. That's the name of the tech, and I would like to show it. Can I actually play it? It should be. Perfect.
Over the course of their history, video games have evolved to bring more and more players into worlds where they can experience new adventures. Step by step, game makers have taken advantage of incremental improvements in technology to push the boundaries of what is possible, always dreaming of bigger and more interactive game worlds, yet always being limited by the computing power at their disposal. What if we could make this limitation a thing of the past? Games are powered by engines. The bigger and deeper games have become, the more complex the engines. Animation, sound, rendering, physics, gameplay, and many more systems are crammed into the engine in very static ways, making major changes increasingly difficult. our approach is different. We are setting game makers free from the restrictions of single machine computing, transforming these engine systems into distributed services and allowing them to harness vast amounts of processing power in the cloud. This enables the construction of gigantic game worlds at a scale far greater than anything that has come before. This technology is built to power the game worlds of tomorrow. To bring them to life, it supports massive numbers of game assets, simulations, AI and player entities. And because the dreams of players and game makers are constantly evolving, this technology is made to evolve alongside them, updating constantly and adding more capabilities as they are needed, without interrupting play. Imagine a game world, vast, rich and fully simulated, populated by an unlimited number of players, all sharing and shaping a single reality together. Not long ago, this could only have been a dream. Today, we are building the technology to make this happen. Introducing Ubisoft Scalar.
So, so much for the tech developed at Ubisoft Stockholm. So it's basically outsourcing all the calculations into the cloud, making it faster and easier for us to run all those simulations and distribute vegetation and gameplay relevant system accordingly to the pre-requirements or whatever you would like to build. So now let's get to the last part. If you're interested in that topic in general, you can take a look at, for example, the extra credits or extra history. They have a couple of videos related to game development in general, and they have one video specifically about ProcGen. It's it's rather on the surface. It doesn't go too deep into the matter, but it's a nice watch. Of course, there is also a GDC talk about Far Cry and how they do procedural generation. They approach it slightly different. I think they are using a similar system as Horizon does, Horizon Zero Dawn, which is also my next recommendation, to take a look at how they do it. It's not image-based. It's a slightly different system, but it suits their needs and what they would like to do with their games. So take a look at those videos. And if you want to know more, just type in procedural generation into YouTube or whatever. And you should get a couple of also tutorials how to use it in Unreal and so on. There is a lot of stuff out there. And that's pretty much it from my side. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. Super interesting presentation, super interesting topic. I saw a comment in the chat, someone saying my brain is not braining this image when you were showing like this notes overview. and I felt that. But before we come to the questions from the chat, I have a question, or to be more precise, I have two questions. So procedural generation in game development is rather a technique or an expertise than a job title. So you, for example, are a game designer working with procedural generation. Going from there, my first question would be who else, so which other development areas like programming, art, etc. are working on or with procedural generation and how?
It's not a job description. I'm a game designer, more specifically a technical designer. That's more related to the job description. Because as I said, you have to put or create logical frameworks or think in a logical way. That's why you have to have an affinity for the technical thing. If you're an artist, you should also be a little bit, as you'd say, dive a little bit into the technical aspect. So you won't draw much or you won't paint much, maybe except the masks or the climate. So you have to really change the way you think in that matter. So it's less related to the job or related to the field, and more related to your personal preference. If you have a thing for that and you like logical processes, feel free.
Okay, so you're kind of answering my second question already a little bit,
Okay.
Which would be how can I get there? So you touched upon this. You have to have an interest in technique and in the logical thinking behind it. So that would be the case for all professions, for like programmers and designers and artists, when procedural generation is part of the job of game development in the future.
Yes, this will most likely be the case. Of course, there will be still fields which do not require that, the more classical fields, and they will still be needed in future games. But everything becomes so technical, and everything is driven by algorithm around us. So not diving into that topic might be an issue later on.
Okay.
So you should have an affinity for that one.
Okay. We have some questions in the chat already, and I know that you also touched upon these a little bit, but I will still read it and maybe you can answer it again. The first question is, for the biomes, how do you delimit the zones where one biome is different from another one? Are you using splines?
You can use splines, yes. We use splines for roads mostly, or for anything that is handcrafted or man-built, so like roads, paths and so on, or a river. You can also use a spline for a river. How we use it is basically we define the biomes and then we start interpolating between those. So when you have like one area is in the tropical region or the tropical biome and the other one is in the boreal, then the temperature difference between those will be interpolated. So it will basically over a space of, I don't know, 10, 20 meters, it will go from the cold temperature into the warm one, going through all the biomes basically, but you as a player won't realize it because you're going through them really fast. It's really just a couple of meters and then you're in the desert or in the boreal rainforest, whatever.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, for the compound where you generate trees, bushes, and clutter, how do you make sure one prop is not overlapping another?
You make that's why you have to build the hierarchy. You make them aware of each other. So before you distribute or calculate one asset or one species, like ferns, for example, and then you say, okay, ferns should impact grass distribution. So you take that information, the position from the fern, and then you create a circle around them that is basically blocking, for example, grass from being scattered. And then you give that information to the grass distribution, so grass is aware of the fern, basically. Or you can use raycasting. A couple of games use that. So basically, while placing stuff, it's also done in a hierarchy, so one after each other, but each time a new asset is placed, a raycast is done to check if there are other objects around. And if there are, this asset won't be placed there. So it's kind of picking free spots somewhere in between other stuff. Yeah, those are two methods you can use to avoid clipping in most cases.
Here's a question to the point or on the point where you were talking about the cloud. So is the idea that the calculations would be streamed like through RTSP, RTMP and rendered in real time?
Yes, that's the idea. So the data should be available in the cloud. Calculations should be done in the cloud, and the client or UPC or your version of the game will receive that information and build the world on your local machine using it. And what we are saving in this case is basically all the calculation processes for that information. So you receive the final results and your game knows then, okay, those trees are going there, those bushes are going there, and it's building it in real time, actually. A couple of things. So one video in the links, for example, the Horizon Zero Dawn, they use GPU scattering of vegetation. So while the player is moving, so it's in real time. The only thing they have is terrain, and they pre-calculated everything, and once the player is playing the game, they're placing it in runtime, basically, while you're running in front of you. It's pretty impressive, and yeah, a lot of stuff.
Okay. Here's another question. Can you talk a little bit about roguelikes and procedural generation? So which parts of world building are relevant for roguelikes?
Oh, I never built a roguelike. That's a good question. Honestly, I'm not sure. I would have to dive into that, so I can't give an answer. Maybe next time, once I have more experience with roguelikes.
Okay. Another question for the cloud thing. Does it mean that future games will have to be played while being constantly connected to the internet?
In this case, if we are using, or if the game is using cloud technology, then yes. But you never know. I mean, hardware is evolving, so at a certain point you will have, or you might have enough power at your home to do that locally. I don't know. Let's see.
Okay. Is procedural generation tools, or are procedural generation tools the best way to generate a game?
If you want to do it fast, yes. The downside is that there is a lot of work and effort beforehand, so because you have to build all those systems. But once they are in place, you could basically feed different data into it, and it should generate you a different result. This is, for example, what we do is we build this whole graph, and what we then do in the beginning is just exchanging the height map, so the terrain. We did a couple of tests with real life data, so we extracted satellite data from the world and fed that into the graph and got the results, so with all the distribution that we wanted. It's fun.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I see no further questions in the chat. If there was a question that I skipped because there was a lot written in the chat, then please just drop it there again. And we can try to answer it.
More questions.
More questions. Okay. I think there is a question coming in. How will you deal with games that don't have enough players to keep the servers running? Will we no longer be able to play?
Yes, that's a good question. I also have no answer for that. We are investigating into that specific topic because it's important to ensure that the game is functional without basically a certain amount of players. But we don't have an answer yet, so I have no idea.
There's a question, would this engine interact with the UbiArt engine?
It might be possible, yes. So Scalar is completely separate as a technology and can be embedded into any engine. Of course, this would require a little bit of effort. Right now, it is possible to use it in Snowdrop. But as I said, it's a module and it's still in development. So further down the line, we plan to use it with all our engines.
Okay. How would cloud generation work in the destructible environments?
Okay, so destructible environments will most likely be something that is happening on the client only. You don't need the cloud for that one because you don't need any big data like a climate or terrain related to that. You can do those changes on the client completely, destroy a building or do terrain changes and then recalculate it or parts of it on the client without touching the cloud. So it should be possible, and I don't think there is a cloud required for a destructive environment.
We have a question that's a bit more personal for you. So if you could start all over again in game development, how would you start?
I think I would directly start in ProcGen. Well, maybe not that early. I started in 2006. Yeah. So while we were using procedural generation there, it wasn't that broadly available and we didn't have that many tools, and it just exploded like in the recent decade or so. So I would like to do that because that's exactly what is fun for me personally. I'm loving it. So for another 6 years, I hope.
Okay. Another question. How will you deal with quality assurance? Is the world pre-generated and checked by world builders, or will it be generated on the fly?
It's both. So if you generate it on the fly, you can also pre-generate it. You just have to assign the task to the process. QA, so there will be people checking the world in terms of the flow. So how does it feel? How are the distances between all the content in between? So you can ensure that there is a certain, so say, gameplay flow ensured in that. And but we also rely a lot of times on automated tests. So you would basically also use algorithm to check the system for bugs or for issues before a new version is built or before any submit is done. So automated testing and a couple of people also.
Okay. Another question. Is Scala going to be an in-house tool or something that may be available for licensed or otherwise use?
No information on that one. Currently it's in-house, but I'm not sure what Ubisoft plans with that one.
Okay. And do you think graphics can get better than they are now? And if they can, is there a limit to how good a game can look?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't think there is a limit to how a game can look. I think the limit is to the hardware. That's the biggest one. We don't have enough power to make game realistic now. And we are reaching uncanny valley currently because we are in the process. So games are looking so good right now that we as humans start to realize the artificial stuff. And we see it directly because everything else is so good or so well done. And I think this will take a while before we jump over that valley, the uncanny valley. But let's see. With increasing hardware, we will get better games or better looking games.
Okay, here's the question. I think you already mentioned it, but is it possible to also use procedural generation not only for how it looks, but also to generate functional map design for game mechanics?
Yes. We did this during one prototype where we called it the breadcrumb system. So once you place landmarks, so for example, a settlement or an outlook tower or an industrial area, you can use that information to place other gameplay relevant aspects out of it. So like content the player can interact with. And you can exchange the type of content based on the surroundings. So for example, you occupy a position and you want to place industrial area there. But dependent on the biome, there is a different industrial area. So for example, if you're in the forest, it might be a lumber hut. If you're, I don't know, besides water, it might be a fisher hut or whatever. And based on that, we could also trigger the distribution or placement of other stuff. So if you kind of have a fishing hut, then you would have fish baskets in the surroundings, something like that the player can interact with. So we can really distribute content independence of each other. We can check where the trees are and distribute mushrooms around trees. We can even check the shadow casting of a tree. So we can let trees cast shadows and use that as information for content.
Here's a question that maybe I can answer or at least start an answer, but you can, of course, add something to that. Can we have an advice to the beginners in game dev? So what I can say is game development is there are a lot of options. So first off, you need to think about where do I want to work? Like, do I want to work in a AAA studio? Do I want to work in an indie studio? So that's the first question. Because if you're working in a smaller studio, in an indie studio, you will most likely need a more generalistic approach on your education or your skill set, because smaller studios need people who know their way around a lot of different things. And the bigger a studio gets and the bigger the projects get, the games get, the more specialized you need to be. So there are not only like 2 programmers or 3 artists like in an indie studio or in a smaller studio, but you have like very big teams, and every programmer and every artist and every designer and everyone else has a very specialized area of experience and skills, and they all work together. So that's the first question you have to ask yourself. And then of course, like, which area do you want to go? Like programming, design, art, production, quality assurance, testing. There's so much. Also a lot of surrounding things like marketing, etc. You asked about game development, but I'm still mentioning them. So that's the second thing. Where do you have your strengths? Where do you have skills? Where do you want to go into deeper? That's the second thing. And then when you know what you want to do and where you want to do it, and you're about to start, then it's super important to have your own projects, to really just work on your own projects, work on games, attend game jams, for example, or get some friends together who can develop a game or do it on your own. I know that's a bit difficult, but do your own stuff, do your own projects, and just learn by doing. That's super important. And build your portfolio. So build something that you can show to people when you are ready to look for a job and talk to people. Talking to people also is a very important point. Go to networking sessions, work as a volunteer for different events and conferences, and just, get yourself out there and get to know people. That's also very important in the games industry. That's my 2 cents on that. Maybe you have something to add?
Yeah, there is not much to add. I think only one thing that I learned during my career in game development is understand or realize what you love to do. Because I was level designer, I was content designer, I was game designer, and now I'm technical designer. And it was all the process of going through all those fields and realizing, okay, that's maybe something not for my taste. Maybe since I'm a more technical guy, I became a technical designer. I also wrote a couple of quests, but I'm not a narrative designer or a writer, so that's not my field at all. So I went away from that. So I really suggest, as you said, dive into the content, make some games yourself or some prototypes using Unreal to really grasp what is fun for you to do. Do you like to write? Do you like to build levels? Do you like to script? Do you like to program? Whatever. Draw or create meshes. And then once you do that, you pretty much set with the portfolio and the clear knowledge of what you would like to be. You're set for the future.
Yes. We have other questions coming in on the topic of procedural generation. So back to the topic.
Yes.
When you implement procedural generation, is it possible to combine volumes, meshes, and voxel methods? For example, if I was creating a volcano with lava fields, flowing liquids, and fractured earth?
Yeah, you would have to combine all those things to make that happen. Of course, it's if you want to solve the lava with your fluid simulation, that can be done. Mm-hmm. That's a nice one. The terrain, you can exchange terrain and runtime shouldn't be also an issue. The issue is really to ensuring that consistency is there, because if you exchange or if you create a whole volcano, since the climate is based on the terrain, the climate will change. So you have to recalculate everything, every step after you place that volcano there. So everything is, consistent.
And another question, how will you assure that places won't look the same? Are there rules in place to limit asset duplication?
Asset duplication. So the second, are there rules to limit asset duplication? Not really. We are using variations. So one thing that we also can do in terms of assets, for example, trees, we can generate a tree in runtime procedurally. Mm-hmm. And we did a couple of tests with growing vegetation even. So we can grow a whole tree from a sapling to a grown up full-fledged tree in real time, basically. And this is all based on certain data. So you don't have to create variations. You can create them on the fly while regenerating or making changes to the game world. What was the first question? Can you repeat that one?
How will you assure that the places won't look the same?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. I don't have a clear answer to that one. You really have to check the areas for yourself and ensure that you have enough variety. So I use this example. That's why I also like the Holdridge live zones, because they have 40 ecosystems. That's in comparison to the 7 or so or 8 from the Whittaker. That's a lot more. So you have a lot more variation, which means that on a distance from, like, let's say 100 meter, you can cycle through like 5 ecosystems instead of only 2. So it's not the same, basically. So this is an approach you can use to get rid of that. And besides that, you have to check. It depends on the size of the world and the granularity. So it's up to you to fix that one. I don't have a clear answer yet.
Okay, I hope that was clear enough. Another question is, how would you deal with simulating environment interactions with part of the world that have not been generated yet or that are not loaded in runtime?
Well, if the player is there, it is loaded. That is the whole process. So, and the challenge. So if you have a huge world and it's all generated in the cloud in runtime, then if the player is not in a certain location, nothing is generated there. It doesn't exist, basically. So it's a weird scenario where we have to look into the future, kind of, and think about what happens if the player is not there. What information should be available? What information do we need to ensure that everything is still working? So, for example, if you have 2 settlements and they are like 5 kilometers away from each other, and we want to build a road between those, and everything should be done in real time, we have to somehow be aware of the second settlement, even if the player is not there. Because if that information is not there, if that point is not there, we can't establish a connection between those. So this is, for example, information that should be available. And you can use low resolution for that. So you can check for those points, like, I don't know, maybe on a resolution of 15 kilometers per pixel, something like that, or 1 kilometer per pixel. You don't need 1 meter per pixel information, so real granular ones. And that should be enough, depending on also the distance. So if you have 5 kilometers between settlements and maybe 200 meters between 2 houses or so the information might not be available. It's a hard challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there are no further questions on the topic in the chat, which is why I think we answered everything. Thank you very much. And this is how we reach the end of our stream. Thanks a lot, everyone, for watching, engaging, asking questions. Also, thank you, Alex, for the presentation, answering
You're
all
welcome.
the questions. And thank you, Jule, for the streaming magic, Malvi and Basti for moderating the chat, and Stefan for helping a lot with the organization. I wish you all a great rest of the day, and I hope we see each other again in early autumn when we are continuing with the lecture series after a nice summer break. And with that, I say goodbye.
Bye-bye.